Welcome to Psyche Talks. Today we're taking a deep dive into one of the most persistent and frankly utterly wild beliefs found across human history and cultures, the idea that people can transform into animals. We've gathered a fascinating stack of sources for this, pulling from ancient folklore, historical accounts, occult traditions, and even some early psychological studies. Our mission today is really to unpack these incredible stories and beliefs, try to figure out how people thought this happened, why this idea held such power, and, what it might tell us about ourselves.
It's absolutely a global phenomenon. I mean, you look anywhere from the forests of Europe, jungles of India, across Africa, the Americas. The concept of shape-shifting, especially into animals, it's remarkably consistent in its core idea, but then infinitely varied in the details.
That variety is what gets me.
Exactly. You see it everywhere. Myths, legal records, personal accounts, even early medical discussions. It really touches on deep-seated fears, desires, and these fundamental questions about identity. Where's the line between human and beast?
Okay, let's dig into that. When you look at these sources, the sheer inventiveness of how people believe this transformation worked is just striking. It wasn't usually some vague magic, was it? There were often very specific methods described.
No, not vague at all, often quite practical in a strange way. The methods really varied. Sometimes it was believed to happen through simple physical contact, like touching a known were animal, or maybe even just stepping in its tracks.
Really? Just stepping in a footprint.
Apparently so in some traditions, but a really common theme is using objects connected to the animal. Wearing an actual animal skin is a big one, or maybe a special girdle made from skin, or some other specific item like a strap or belt.
But literally putting on a wolf's coat to become one.
Pretty much, yeah. And then, of course, you had the more overtly magical means, things like special ointments rubbed on the body, potions that you'd drink, or specific spells and incantations you'd recite.
Ah, the classic witch's brew kind of thing.
Sort of, yeah. These often involved quite specific rituals, sometimes needing certain places, certain times of night, maybe certain moon cheeses. The sources are just full of these little details, which suggests people had this idea of a real perceived process for transformation.
It's fascinating that it wasn't always seen as just an innate ability, It often required an action. So, okay, let's say you went through the ritual, put on the wolf skin, whatever, and boom, you're a wolf. How did you get back? Because I imagine most people didn't plan on staying that way forever.
That's a very good question. And yeah, the reversal methods are just as varied and specific as the ways to transform in the first place. The most straightforward was often just reversing the initial action, like taking off the skin or the girdle was frequently thought to be enough.
Simple enough.
But folklore is never that simple.
Oh, I bet. What else did they think could break the spell? This is where it gets interesting, right?
It really does. A very powerful belief was that inflicting a wound on the animal form could do it. A stab from a knife, or maybe a shot from a gun, was thought to force the human shape to return, especially if it drew blood.
But again, details mattered, I'm guessing.
Absolutely. The lore often specified where you had to strike the animal hitting it on the brow, for instance, or right between the eyes.
Precision required.
And if a gun was used, the bullet ideally needed to be silver. Some traditions even added another layer that the silver bullet should be blessed, maybe in a chapel dedicated to St. Hubert, who is the patron saint of hunters.
Wow.
It really highlights how deeply integrated these beliefs were into people's whole understanding of the world, the natural, the supernatural, the religious, all woven together.
That level of prescription is incredible. It really makes you wonder what real-life events or maybe social dynamics might have fed into these incredibly specific details. Were there other ways to break the enchantment? Maybe some that sound, less conventional.
Oh, definitely. The sources mention some pretty strange ones, things like plunging into water or rolling around in dew.
Bowling and dew, okay.
Then there's the rather extreme method of kneeling in one spot for 100 years, which, let's be honest, feels more like a cautionary tale or maybe a metaphor than actual practical advice.
Yeah, 100 years seems a bit impractical. Just a tad.
Just a bit. Other reported methods included being saluted with the sign of the cross, or, and this one comes up in several stories, being called 3 times by your proper baptismal name by another person.
Ah, the power of a name.
Exactly. Striking the creature's forehead 3 times with a knife, or drawing just 3 drops of blood were also mentioned sometimes. And then there was the idea of a specific reversal formula, maybe known only to one other person. If that person died or wasn't around, you could be trapped.
Permanently trapped. That Indian tiger story, we should get to later, really drives home the sheer terror of that possibility.
Wow.
It's a horrifying concept.
And speaking of catalysts, you mentioned numbers earlier. Were there transformations tied to specific folklore or even like predestination?
Oh, yes. Numbers like 7 and 9 pop up constantly in this stuff. The idea of the seventh child being fated to be a werewolf, that's a classic example of predestination.
Right.
Transformation spells or curses were often said to last for, say, 9 days or required actions to be repeated 7 or 9 times. There are these specific local legends, too, like one from Lorraine about men throwing blessed grass stalks over their shoulders to turn into wolves, or a myth about putting a certain slip of wood in your mouth to become a she-bear.
Little regional variations.
Exactly. These specific localized legends really show how the belief was woven into the fabric of everyday life and regional identity. It wasn't just some abstract concept.
The specificity, again, is just wild. It really makes you wonder what real fears or social tensions these beliefs might have been reflecting or managing. And what was the ultimate fate for someone who was identified as a war animal in many of these societies? Doesn't sound like it ended well.
No, sadly, the outcome was almost universally grim. The death penalty was the common sentence. And much like the witchcraft trials, which were often happening concurrently or linked, the accused often faced brutal ordeals first. Things like dipping a finger into boiling resin, supposedly to prove their guilt or innocence before the sentence was even passed.
Oh, well.
It links these beliefs directly to wider patterns of fear, accusation, persecution, very dark periods of history.
That connection to witchcraft feels crucial, doesn't it? One of the key beliefs linking were animals and witches was this idea, you mentioned it earlier, repercussion, that a wound inflicted on the animal form would miraculously appear on the human body.
Absolutely central. This concept of repercussion was incredibly powerful evidence in the eyes of accusers. If a hunter, say, wounded a wolf in the leg and later they found a local person, maybe someone already suspected of witchcraft, with an identical, inexplicable wound in their leg,
That was proof positive for them.
that was seen as irrefutable proof of transformation. It was even used, horrifyingly, to justify burning bewitched animals alive. The belief was that the human witch was somehow inside the animal form, and the burning would compel them to return to their true shape to escape the flames.
That's deeply disturbing. Stories really bring these beliefs and the terror surrounding them to life, though. Can you share a few from the sources that kind of illustrate these points?
Certainly, there's an anecdote about a woman named Margaret, accused of being a werewolf. Her transformation was supposedly undone when someone, in the heat of the moment, cried out her baptismal name while she was in wolf form, just like that reversal method we talked about.
The name thing again.
Exactly. Then you have a slightly different angle with the Russian nobleman story. He apparently transformed into a wolf, but purely for practical reasons, to hunt and provide meat for his party when their provisions ran out. It shows a more utilitarian view of the ability, not necessarily evil.
Right. Practical shape-shifting, not just malice.
Precisely. But then you have that truly tragic Indian tale we touched on. A man could change into a tiger, but he needed a friend to say the magic words to change him back.
Oh, I remember the setup.
Well, the friend died. The man tried to teach the reversal formula to his wife, but the next time he was in tiger form, she panicked, she was terrified, and she completely forgot the words. Trapped, enraged by her fear, maybe confused in his animal state, he attacked and killed her.
Oh, no.
Realizing the horror of what he'd done, he was now permanently a tiger, haunted by his actions, and supposedly driven to attack humans from then on. This story became so ingrained, the sources say, that it led to a local saying in the Sanjur and Arbuda territories about any tiger that had killed a person, they believed it must be that cursed man.
Wow. That's incredibly powerful. It really underscores the potential for unintended, devastating consequences in these beliefs. It's also striking how the type of animal involved in these stories often seems to mirror the local wildlife, doesn't it?
Oh, that's a very clear pattern you see in the sources, absolutely. You find tales of were tigers in India, as we said. Were bears are common in Northern Europe. You get were lions, leopards, hyenas in parts of Africa, jaguars in South America. It wasn't universally wolves, even though lycanthropy is the term we know best.
The lycanthropy is just one flavor.
Exactly. The sources explicitly mention things like were dogs, that's cananthropy, and even were cattle, or bolanthropy. It really shows the breadth of animals implicated. It's almost as if the local apex predator, or maybe just a significant local animal, became the natural focus for these transformation fears and legends.
And this wasn't just folklore, was it? It had real-world, often brutal implications for people accused.
Without a doubt. In the Poitou region of France, for instance, there was this recognized local concept called courir la galopote, which basically meant running the fields as a were animal at night. It was a known thing.
Part of the local reality.
Yes. And legal systems actually incorporated these fears. You find decrees, like one issued in Dole, that specifically permitted citizens to hunt and kill suspected werewolves without facing any penalty themselves. Hundreds, possibly thousands, of individuals across Europe faced trials. Many were condemned to horrific executions, burning at the stake, being broken on the wheel, accused not just of transformation, but often linked crimes like murder and cannibalism.
But as we get closer to the Enlightenment period, the understanding, or at least the official interpretation of these phenomena starts to shift a bit, doesn't it?
It does, gradually. You see figures like King James I of England, who, ironically, wrote a whole treatise on demonology, starting to suggest that maybe lycanthropy wasn't always a literal physical change caused by devils. Perhaps, he mused, it was a form of mental illness, a delusion, maybe linked to what they called melancholia.
A psychological explanation starting to emerge.
Exactly. And the famous trial of Jean Grenier, a young boy accused of being a werewolf in the early 17th century, is often seen as a bit of a turning point. Instead of being executed, he was ultimately judged to be suffering from a delusion and sent to an asylum. It suggests medical or psychological perspectives were beginning to challenge or at least influence the purely supernatural or legal understanding.
And that really bizarre case from Ansbach in 1685 seems like a perfect, if slightly grotesque, illustration of that shifting ground.
Oh, the Ansbach wolf. Yes, it's a really telling moment. When a wolf that had been terrorizing the countryside was finally killed, they didn't just dispose of it, they paraded its carcass through the town, dressed it up in men's clothes, put a wig on it, and even gave it a mask made to look like a recently deceased, very unpopular local burgomaster.
They dressed up the wolf.
They did, and exhibited it as proof that this unpopular official had been the werewolf all along. The sheer theatricality of it dressing up a dead wolf, it suggests that even while they were trying to confirm the old belief in lycanthropy, they sort of had to stage it. It feels less like a genuine belief in literal magical transformation and more like...
Well, using the werewolf concept as a framework to blame someone unpopular for inexplicable violence, perhaps projecting social anxieties onto this figure.
It's like they were trying to force the old explanation onto a reality that maybe didn't quite fit anymore. Fascinating. Now, beyond these external methods or maybe inherent abilities, some sources suggest transformation was seen as a form of divine punishment, right?
Yes, that's another distinct category you find. There's a well-known Russian folktale where the apostles Peter and Paul encounter a very cruel and inhospitable couple. As divine judgment for their lack of charity, the apostles turn them into bears.
Direct divine intervention. Precisely. And similarly, you have stories like that of Albertus Paracovius, or a certain nobleman near Prague. Both were described as powerful but incredibly cruel figures. The belief arose that they were transformed into monstrous wild dogs, sometimes described as having human heads, as a direct result of divine retribution for their wickedness and the curses people had laid upon them. So it's transformation as cosmic justice.
So it wasn't always about a human choosing to transform or being cursed by a witch. Sometimes it could be seen as God's doing. This leads us into a slightly different realm, doesn't it? What if the transformation wasn't always conceived as a literal physical change of the body? What about beliefs where it was more about the soul or the spirit?
This is where the concepts get perhaps more complex, maybe more deeply psychological or spiritual. The idea of the soul or some part of the spirit existing temporarily apart from the body is present in many indigenous belief systems worldwide. You see terms like tamani or manitou among certain North American tribes, referring to aspects of a person's spirit or vital force that could potentially separate or manifest externally, often in animal form.
Like a spirit animal, but more intrinsically linked.
Exactly. And killing that animal manifestation was considered incredibly dangerous because it was believed to be intrinsically linked to or even contain the human soul or life force. There's an example given of a serpent called Elengula that was connected to a specific chief. Harming the serpent meant harming the chief.
So in these cases, the animal form isn't the person's physical body changing shape, but rather their soul or spirit somehow inhabiting or manifesting as that animal.
That seems to be the idea in many of these traditions. You have the Florida legend of an alligator ghost believed to be the spirit of a deceased man haunting the area, or certain Californian Indian beliefs about their grandmother's soul entering the body of a she-bear after her death.
Wow.
And even familiar domestic animals, cats, dogs, horses, were viewed in some European traditions as potential vessels for human souls, spirits, or the magical powers of individuals, particularly witches and their supposed familiars.
The divine punishment stories also kind of touch on this link between the physical and spiritual, don't they? The couple turned into bears. It's a physical change, but it's framed as a consequence for their spiritual failings, their cruelty.
Yes, absolutely. They bridge that gap between the physical transformation and the moral or spiritual state of the person. And this whole concept of spiritual change leads to yet another type of transformation discussed in the sources, which is purely metaphorical change.
Ah, like changing your ways.
Exactly. Think of religious figures like Andrew Corsini or St. William of Aquitaine. Their personal histories describe them as initially having wolfish or wild beast characters, meaning they were cruel, violent, or lived dissolute lives. Their conversion to piety and gentleness was often described using the metaphor of them becoming a gentle lamb.
So transformation simply as a metaphor for an internal, moral, or spiritual shift.
Precisely. But then, complicating things further, you have cases that seem to involve something else entirely, perhaps possession by an animal spirit, or maybe even just an illusion projected onto someone.
Okay, how did that work?
Well, there's an account from Gufat in Ethiopia of a woman believed to be possessed by a hyena spirit. She exhibited hyena-like behaviors, and the cure required an exorcism, suggesting an external entity was involved. Then there are stranger stories, like a blacksmith who seemed to turn an old woman into a donkey using magic, though she reportedly retained her human feelings and awareness, suggesting her body was altered, but her mind or spirit remained intact.
Bizarre.
And then you have the case of St. Macarius healing a girl who only appeared to others to be a stoat or a mare. This was interpreted not as a real physical change, but as a devil's illusion, or perhaps even a kind of hypnotic spell cast upon the observers to make them see her differently.
So the transformation was potentially just in the eye of the beholder, or a trick of the mind, or maybe a demon's doing.
Yes, it introduces this element of doubt about the literal physical reality in some accounts. And speaking of demons, the sources are absolutely full of examples where devils and demons themselves are said to take on animal forms.
To deceive or frighten.
Exactly. A bull attacking a saint's cradle, dog-like demons confronting St. Peter in visions, or St. Pascal Billon facing down demons disguised as roaring lions and tigers. The devil himself is often described metaphorically in Christian tradition as a ravening wolf, again forging that link between a specific animal form and malevolent spiritual forces.
And what about animal ghosts? Are they related to this cluster of ideas?
They seem to exist in this blurry space, too. You get all these legends of spectral animals. The roaring bull of Bagbury is a famous one, or the ghost of a cruel squire at Millerdrop said to appear as a flayed bull. There's the spectral bear supposedly haunting the Tower of London, or countless tales of phantom black dogs and ghostly hares.
What were they thought to be?
Sometimes they were identified as specters of the dead, perhaps people who had a strong connection to the location or met a violent end there. Other times they were seen simply as demons taking animal forms specifically to frighten or harass the living.
And this is where that concept of the phantasmal double comes in, right? As maybe another way to bridge the physical body and these spiritual or psychic phenomena.
Exactly. Some thinkers, like Adolf Diaz-Zira, mentioned in the sources, proposed this quite modern-sounding idea that humans might be able to project a kind of living and phantasmal image, essentially a psychic double or maybe an elemental form out from themselves, and that this projection could take an animal shape.
Like astral projection almost, but into an animal.
Something like that, yes. Stories cited in support include things like a spider whose spirit double was supposedly seen at a seance miles away from the physical spider, or a shepherd whose sinister double was observed doing evil deeds while the shepherd himself was elsewhere. But the most compelling examples are those that link this projected double back to the physical body via repercussion.
Ah, the wound connection again.
Right. Like the story of Miller Bigot, a man accused of sorcery. His wife encountered a strange animal, maybe a cat or a wolf, and managed to injure it, perhaps putting out its eye. Later, her husband, Miller Bigot, was found to have mysteriously lost an eye with the exact same injury. The interpretation here wasn't necessarily that his physical body transformed, but that the animal was his projected psychic double, and the injury to the double reflected back onto his physical form.
Wow, that's incredibly complex. So we've got physical change via magic items or spells. We've got divine punishment, spiritual possession, illusion, demonic manifestation, soul projection into animals, animal ghosts, and purely metaphorical change. It's a huge spectrum of beliefs wrapped around this core idea of human-animal links.
It really is.
Okay, let's broaden our view a bit beyond just wolves and bears. The sources talk quite a bit about other animals too, like the werefox, especially in Asia.
Yes, werefoxes or kitsune in Japan and hulajing in China are hugely significant figures in East Asian folklore. They're often depicted very differently from European werewolves. They're usually incredibly cunning, intelligent beings, known for gaining knowledge, often by transforming into scholars. They're famous for enchanting or bewitching people, sometimes tricking them, sometimes falling in love with them.
And there's something about a pearl.
Yes, there's often a belief associated with them about a mystic pearl, sometimes held in their mouth, which is thought to contain their soul or their magical power. Losing the pearl could mean losing their powers or even their life. The stories are fascinating, like a captain encountering a beautiful, mysterious woman he suspects is a werewolf vixen because of her strange knowledge and behavior. Or that uncanny tale of a doctor called to a supposedly haunted house, where he starts experiencing weird, partial animal transformations himself.
Starts changing.
It's just slightly, like his hands feel furry or his face feels elongated. Later, they find the corpse of a tanuki, a badger-like creature hidden nearby, suggesting it was the source of the haunting and the strange transformative influence.
Ah, the tanuki. The badger dog creature. They feature in Japanese folklore too, right?
Yes, the tanuki is another major transformer in Japanese tales, often sharing the reputation for shape-shifting with the fox, though sometimes depicted as more mischievous, maybe a bit more bumbling or prone to tricks that backfire. You get stories like a haunted lake where fishermen keep disappearing, blamed on a tanuki, or a tanuki ghost causing disturbances in a deserted chapel.
So beyond these creatures having inherent abilities, were there also magical methods used on people to force them into animal shapes against their will?
Absolutely. This is where witches often come back into the picture in European folklore. A really common legend involves witches turning men, often unsuspecting travelers or rivals, into horses.
Turning them into horses.
Usually by using a magic bridle or halter. They'd throw it over the man's head and he'd transform. The stories often involve the witch then riding the unfortunate man-horse, sometimes quite cruelly. There are variations where the victim is ridden so hard they develop horse-like hands or feet even after returning to human form. Or sometimes the victim manages to turn the tables, get the magic halter onto the witch, and ride her as a mare.
Reversal of fortune.
Exactly. And there are other more unsettling stories too, like a witch who reportedly sold a man an enchanted egg, telling him to break it when he got home. When he did, an animal form supposedly emerged and enveloped him, transforming him against his will.
Goodness. These stories really highlight transformation as a tool of control, malice, or even a kind of supernatural enslavement.
Yeah.
And we touched briefly on secret societies earlier.
Yes, the sources mention historical accounts, or perhaps more often, fearful legends about secretive groups like the human leopards in parts of Africa or the Canaima tigers in South America. These were believed to be societies or individuals who would use animal disguises, leopard skins, jaguar pelts, along with rituals or spiritual practices to carry out violent acts, sometimes ritualistic killings or revenge attacks.
So maybe not literal transformation, but using the animal guise.
It's often ambiguous in the accounts. The line between literal belief in transformation and the ritualized adoption of an animal persona for specific, often violent purposes can be very blurry. And interestingly, the concept of repercussion injuries sustained while in the animal dies or form appearing on the human member of the society later is strongly linked to these groups in some stories, further blurring that line.
It's clear this whole complex of beliefs is woven so deeply into global mythology and literature too, not just folk tales or trial records.
Completely. It's everywhere once you start looking. You see it in ancient Greek myths, like Circe famously turning Odysseus's men into swine. Or in Egyptian mythology, where gods frequently shapeshift into animal forms to escape danger or interact with the world.
Right.
It appears in satirical literature like Lucian's hilarious, if somewhat cautionary, account of his adventures after being accidentally transformed into an ass. And of course, you find it in Shakespeare. Think of Puck's playful, mischievous transformations in A Midsummer Night's Dream. It's a constant motif.
The sources also list a whole menagerie of various hybrid or animal-like creatures found in folklore and myth. Were these also seen as transformers, or were they something different entirely?
Many of them were indeed believed to possess the ability to shapeshift, adding yet another layer to this whole complex. Creatures like the demonic Rakshasa from Hindi mythology, the powerful serpentine Nagas also from India, the elemental jinns of Middle Eastern lore, mythical beasts like griffins, even mermaids. They were often described as being able to assume human form or other animal forms at will. Or sometimes they existed in a kind of perpetual state between human and animal. They really represent that fundamental, enduring fascination with crossing or even erasing the boundaries between species.
Which brings us back in a way to the use of those animal skins or objects we started with. That poignant Arawak legend from South America about the lovesick maiden who became a dog. But something beautiful, if rather sad, example of using a skin, isn't it?
It really is. In that story, she gets hold of a dog skin, puts it on, and is able to take the form of a dog specifically so she can follow the man she loves who doesn't notice her as a human.
She uses it as a disguise.
Exactly. But when he eventually discovers her secret and, crucially, destroys the dog skin, she's permanently restored to her human form. She can't change back to a dog. It's a more romantic, maybe symbolic use of the transformation motif, focusing on disguise and identity, contrasting sharply with some of the darker European tales of forced transformation or monstrousness.
And different again from purely symbolic shifts, like those rapid, almost kaleidoscopic transformations in the Welsh romance of Taliesin you mentioned.
Right, where the transformations hare, fish, bird, grain of wheat seem more about demonstrating incredible magical prowess or the fluidity of identity rather than becoming a specific beast. Or conversely, the idea found in some tales, like the story of Lady Sybil, that transformation could represent a descent in the scale of being. She was turned into a white doe, apparently due to a diabolical pact made by an ancestor, representing a fall from grace, a loss of human status.
We've covered so much ground here. I mean, from magical ointments and silver bullets to soul projection, divine punishment, enchanted skins, metaphorical change. Looking back at this entire incredibly rich stack of sources, what's the overarching takeaway for you? What does the sheer variety and the sheer persistence of these beliefs tell us?
I think that persistence, right across cultures and across centuries, is the absolute key. It tells us that humans, everywhere and always, seem to have grappled with certain fundamental questions. Questions like, what are the boundaries of the self? What defines human? What is our relationship with the animal world, both outside us and perhaps within us? What's the relationship between the mind, the body, the spirit? What is the nature of evil or transgression, and how does it manifest? And how do we categorize and understand the natural world and our own place within it? These stories, in all their weird and wonderful variations, feel like attempts to explore, explain, and maybe contain the answers to those huge questions.
So it's like trying to put a framework, a narrative, around the mysterious, the terrifying, and maybe even sometimes the alluring aspects of stepping outside the perceived bounds of being strictly human.
Exactly that. And the sources offer just myriad explanations for how that boundary could be crossed. Literal physical change through magic or occult forces, direct divine punishment or intervention, mental delusion or illness, maybe psychic projection, demonic influence, simple illusion, spiritual inhabitation. Each approach tries to make sense of the perceived phenomenon, but using the dominant worldview, the available tools of explanation, of its specific time and place.
It makes that observation by Lord Byron particularly resonant, doesn't it? The one you mentioned, that sometimes, even without transformation, men become wolves on any slight occasion.
It's a chillingly insightful thought, isn't it? It highlights how these beliefs might also function as ways of externalizing, or perhaps grappling with, the animalistic capacities we recognize within human nature itself, capacities for violence, for cruelty, for instinctual behavior that frightens us. Maybe the werewolf legend, in particular, isn't just about magic or demons, but also about the deep-seated fear of losing control, of succumbing to the beast within, the potential for savagery that exists inside ordinary people.
That's a really powerful way to look at it. It feels like, despite all these historical explanations we've touched on, from folklore to occultism to early psychology, the fundamental mystery of human-animal transformation continues to capture our imagination even today.
It absolutely does. It remains this incredibly rich area for exploring human belief, our deepest fears, our complex connection to the animal world, and those enduring questions about what it truly means to be human. It really prompts us, I think, to keep wondering, where are the real boundaries of transformation, consciousness, identity, and are they perhaps more porous, more permeable than we usually like to assume?
A mystery that definitely continues to fascinate.
Indeed it does.
Thank you for your support and for listening.